All right. So you guys all came up with a question. You got a T and an O and a time at risk and a model specification. So how many of you feel like you've got what you know to just do this yourself right now in the next hour or so? Not so confident. Oh, no, I wasn't confident. I want you to hold on to them. Yes. Although, actually, you might have just volunteered there. All right. So we've got a couple options of what we were thinking to do. And so I'll just put it to you guys about what you would like to do. I would like for us to at least hear some of the questions that you guys are interested in and talk about them as a group just to go through the framework and see whether or not we all agree it's a good framework. And so then we can get through that. And at the end, we've actually just thought about an exercise to potentially pivot what we were originally going to do. Originally, we were just going to have you break into groups and do your own studies, and we can totally do that if you want to. The other option is those that volunteer for good questions, and when we reached one as a group that we think is a good question, that we all work on it together and actually do a study and publish in JAMA by the end of the day. We're doing that? All right, we're doing that. Okay. So just to grease the wheels then, whoever's willing to, actually, can we turn this volume down? Is it okay in the back? This is just me. All right, so whoever, if you're volunteering, this is going to cut both ways. First is you should be prepared that your question is going to be attacked by the whole room, and we're going to challenge whether it's a good question. But on the flip side, if your question is good and it gets selected by the group, you get to be the lead author of a JAMA paper. All right. So any volunteers? Joyce, we got a first volunteer. Oh, can we do that? Can we do the mic? Okay, thanks. All right. So first, just tell us your problem, and then I'm gonna write it down after we go through it together.
So we're interested in looking at male children with hemophilia A that who receive factor VIII. And the question is, we want to be able to predict if they're going to develop inhibitory antibodies to factor VIII. So.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, sorry. So the target cohort that we're interested in is male children with hemophilia A who receive factor VIII for treatment. And the outcome that we're interested in is development of inhibitory antibodies to factor VIII.
And I'm sorry, I'm not clinically oriented. What is that? Some antibody of some sort?
Inhibitory.
Inhibitory antibodies. And during what's your, so that's your T and your O?
Yes, and so our time 0, I guess, would be the first exposure to factor VIII.
Okay, this is the factor VIII, yeah.
Yeah, and then our time at risk, we said until development of inhibitory antibodies.
So from the time that they start,
yes,
until when?
Until they develop inhibitory antibodies, or do we have to actually put a...
So what about the people who don't develop the antibodies?
Oh, that's true. So
that's where we put 3, I mean, it was pretty arbitrary, 3 to 5 years.
Okay, so some fixed time period.
Some fixed time, yeah.
Okay, and you're basically going to say, so I'll just say 3 years just for the fun of it. So in 3 years after they start factor VIII,
yes,
of this people, those who develop inhibitory antibodies. So what was your general model thinking about this?
I don't have an answer for that one. Oh. we said we'll try the lasso. Okay. And then 3 other models that you...
3 models that the researchers have presented here. We would like
just give them a shot?
Yeah.
Okay. And what's your, I'm sorry, I should have my hand out here. What do you expect that it's going to look like? So you came up with this problem. What do you think is going to happen here?
So we do think that some of them will develop, but I guess we're more interested in seeing if it's based on race or genetics, who actually develops the inhibitory antibodies. Is that what you mean by?
Yeah, so do you suspect that this is going to be a highly predictable problem? Should we be able to get this? Or is it going to be like random guessing because it's really...
I don't think it's going to be very predictable.
Okay, so it might not be very predictable.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we're not sure.
But you don't know, so it's worthwhile to try.
We don't know. We
Yep.
want to actually run it and see whether
See if it could.
what good question for a predictive model.
Very good. Okay, and so aside from the fact that you guys regulate factor 8 products, presumably. So it's kind of hard to say, how are you guys going to use this model? but nonetheless, I'll ask, so how are you guys going to use this model?
So we think that at least for a doctor, if they have this model, they could basically see if the patient, if they do have a high chance of getting the inhibitory antibodies, they could at least develop a plan on how they would manage it in the future.
So if at the time that they prescribe or use the factor 8, they could maybe think about what to do for that subset of people.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay.
There are two classes of factor 8, one recombinant and one plasma-derived. And we think that there might be a difference in terms of development of inhibitory antibody between the two groups and the switchers.
Very good. Okay. Great. So I'm going to start with my own biased opinions. I think you have specified a very well specified problem. You've got a clear T, you got a clear O. It sounds like it's kind of an arbitrary time risk, but you at least gave me a clear number, 3 years. So that's good. And it sounds like you've thought through that you're not sure it's going to be predictable, but we don't know, and you think that there's actually a use for this. So that's kind of cool. The class, what do you guys think about this problem? Anything you're worried about?
So I have a question about the outcome.
Oh, can we pass the mic? Sorry. I want to capture all of this for the recording.
How do you identify the outcome on a real-world database? Using a diagnostic code or a loading code for a lab parameter?
You can pass them back and forth. You can moderate. Can you?
I'll try to answer.
Between you and me, Peter, we take up the whole camera, so it's all good.
I'll try to answer this the best I can. So when they would receive the normal dose of their factor 8 after a bleed and they would not respond, so the result would be receiving a very, very large dose of factor 8 or switching to factor 7 when they have developed the inhibitory antibodies.
So that's a really, really important point. So you had this conceptual idea that the development of inhibitory antibodies was the kind of the outcome, but in terms of observing it, this will be proved by seeing, I'm sorry, don't know, factor 7?
Factor 7,
okay, so this
or there's a code called FIBA, which is basically use of a very large dose of factor 8.
Or FIBA?
Yeah, and then also the ordering of an assay called Bethesda assay.
Or ordering of some assay. Okay.
Which would be a lab test order.
So does that satisfy your question? Okay, that's good. That's a very good question. I didn't know what that was either. So now it sounds like we actually are almost down to like codes and logic that we could use to define that outcome. Any other questions or challenges for volunteer 1?
Continuing with non-malignant hematology.
Wait, are you switching questions?
Yeah.
Stick with this one first.
Okay.
Then we're going to get some more volunteers.
I will tell you, sticking with non-malignant heme, this is a very important question with a lot of controversy about how to manage these patients who can be very delicate and fragile.
So that's a +1 for good question.
Yes.
All right. Any other question? Wojciech, you got a question or comment for them?
It's a question I was puzzled as well when it asked about which parameters, and I wrote, you mean hyperparameters for the lasso model? Because we learned some vocabulary like don't use risk factors, use prediction factors. But we are suddenly asked parameters, and I was puzzled whether it's parameters for are these the hyperparameters, or what exactly is meant here by which parameters?
Yeah, so it's my fault because I created this little form. I was a little bit loose there, but what I really meant was all of those questions you're asked in the Atlas form, all of those design decisions, each of those are parameters to this standardized thing. So that includes model hyperparameters, like what do you want to do for your cross-validation, but it's also things like what if someone was in the outcome cohort prior to, like, could someone have possibly had factor 7 before getting this? Well, so like, that's one of those decisions. Like, if you observe that in the data, would you want to include that person or not? If it doesn't happen, then it's not a problem. But those choices, all those questions that you were asked, yes or no, that's what I meant by parameters.
Okay.
Questions, comments for the team? Matt? That's a good question.
Prevalence?
Yeah, just of people who have picked these cohorts in any database that anyone has access to in this room.
Yeah, so there's like 20,000 hemophilia There are about, I think, 20,000 hemophilia A males in the U.S. That varies a lot depending on what paper you read, so maybe someone else has.
In the U.S., so that's not all that common.
No.
And then what
And
is
the
this thing?
inhibitory, I think it's like 10% maybe developed.
About 10%? 10% of those.
Yeah. People who have more substantive knowledge might have another thing to say.
So Matt's raising an interesting point, which is, okay, that's not a huge population.
No.
It's actually a pretty large fraction of people that have the outcome, so that's actually somewhat promising. But even still, potentially there's like a feasibility concern that we would, the reason we want to use the whole OHDSI network is because maybe one source isn't going to be enough for that. That's good.
Yeah,
Got it.
that's true.
Got it. So one potential concern might be, this might be infeasible just because sample size. Okay, that's a really good question to be thinking about. Any other questions or comments for that team? Nicole, wait for the mic.
I'm just wondering about the actual features that we'll be putting in this model. So at the time they get their factor, what is the factor first? 8, factor 8, the T. So we need some time before that to classify our features. What leads a kid to get that treatment who has haemophilia A? And are they, so what I think I'm trying to say is, how can we distinguish the features of what predicts them going onto treatment as opposed to getting the outcome? Because it might be that we need to come up with a more fancy model where we've got time varying type features after the first treatment. See what I'm saying?
We were struggling with the same question, whether to do this study in children or in adults, because children are born with it, and very early in life, perhaps before their first birthday, they would start the prophylactic exposure. So this is a very good question that we were also struggling with. If we are looking at children and they are very young and there's not a whole lot of environmental exposure during their lifetime to look at, then what are we left with? Maybe it's not a good question for predictive modeling if we're looking at kids.
How quickly does it, how fast is it till they get it? The antibodies?
If I'm not mistaken, the inhibitory antibodies, we don't know. It varies. But exposure to factor 8 is probably before their first birthday.
Got it.
I just looked it up on today. So incidence of patients who have hemophilia A is about 1 in 5,000 live births. People who develop the inhibitory antibodies is somewhere about 25 to 30%.
Oh, wow.
And out of those, they occur primarily early in treatment within the first 50 days in children. And at least up to date thinks that there are predisposing factors. So this may be a predictable outcome.
Very cool.
The question is whether you need whether you need the time when they start using it, or it doesn't matter. I think that's where you. Yeah, but so either you just take whichever patient there is with factor 8, or you say the moment they start on factor 8, when they're babies, then we're going to look for 3 years. But then how, otherwise, when does the time start actually? Maybe we don't even need the 3 years. Maybe you can do any time, there is, as long as we can see them.
So one challenge I would imagine, if I'm understanding the clinical situation a little bit, is you're talking about something that happens in babies or near birth. So one of the challenges I can imagine from a data perspective is what kind of baseline variables will we have? Because you're not going to have much medical history on someone with no personal history.
Other than we can get, for example, some variables that we may not be able to capture in our databases, such as conditions of the pregnancy, some specific genetic factors.
Sure.
These data elements may not be available in the data sets that we work.
Sure. So it might be a challenge on the baseline variables might be challenges because of the population. If this happened to have been a disease that starts at age 10, you'd have no concerns about that particular issue. Okay.
It seems that some risk scores do exist, but you're right that they do revolve around genetic factors, family history, things that may not be
difficult. Okay.
in these databases, but also how severe their bleeding episodes are, whether they're in the ICU or not. Age and race also matter, so it's a maybe, but it seems like we might need more information to really have a good model.
Okay. Great discussion and good job, and thank you for volunteering for that one. We got nominee number 1. Anybody else want to be a volunteer? Yeah. Sure. That's all right.
This needs a mic. This needs a mic.
Yes, it does. This is great, but.
Can I say yet?
Yeah.
So I was going to volunteer my idea, but I just found my neighbor here has a better idea than I do. So what if we got a bunch of ideas and voted up at least a few and then walked through the full models of those and then decided one?
Okay, I like that. So why don't we do this? So everybody come up with your one-liner to basically just rattle off your T, your O, and your time at risk. We'll worry about the other things. So, and you don't have to if you don't have a good question, but if you want to, just raise your hand and we'll just run around the room. You'll be the rove to see until you hit a volunteer. All right, we got one. And I apologize, I'm gonna take very quick
I'll
shorthand
pass it down.
just to get them down.
So just really quick, and I don't know if this is feasible because I'm OHDSI newbie. Something along the line of a surgical procedure. So mechanical thrombolysis for like stroke, plus cadre of drugs at discharge, right? So that's the T. The outcome is any readmission or any ED. So going after like at this like bundled care, the time at risk is 90 days post discharge, and just very quickly like elastologid, all covariates and some regularization term 0.00001 or something on the lasso. So and I'm really interested in this general policy evaluation approach of OHDSI, and I don't know if the timestamps for ED use and any readmission are viable. 90 days for like a larger episode. No, it depends on what you're looking at. Complication rates for a total hip and knee replacement are 90, and a lot of these bundled MIPS programs now rebranded are like 90 days, right? So I can go more into that, but
Okay.
it's boundaries.
All right, so basically, just let me just sure I capture it with my horrible handwriting. So patients who were hospitalized and had mechanical thrombosis or stroke, and you're looking for a 90-day readmission. Okay. Right.
Quick question for mine is, patients who are admitted to the hospital, the primary diagnosis of pneumonia, and the outcome is ICU stay, and looking at 30 days.
What do you mean ICU stay?
So
whether or not they had an ICU stay?
Whether or not they had an ICU stay.
So.
Not necessarily admission. So I think the goal of this would be to predict at the moment, hopefully that they step in the door, whether you're able to predict how sick they're going to be, and maybe better dictate your triage and or clinical care based on that.
Cool. I walk in the door with pneumonia. Am I going to be in the ICU in the next 90 days? Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Anyone else volunteer?
The question I'd like to ask and predict is for like a general population that has vitamin D deficiency, and look at those population and see how many of them will develop cancer in next maybe 3 to 5 years. So the target population, I think I like to look at the just adults, like 18 to 65, not too old, because other factors will come in. So this population and also the first diagnosis of vitamin D deficiency is low. Yeah.
So people with their first diagnosis of vitamin D deficiency, age 18 to 65, whether or not they have an cancer.
A diagnosis with cancer in the next 3 to 5 years, 3 years or
3 years.
5 years maybe better.
5 years. Okay. And cancer, so you're looking for
any type of cancer.
Any type of cancer.
Yeah,
okay.
That's
All right.
And the use of this might be just help people, like if they are low vitamin C, then this will alert them that you have higher risk of developing cancer, so get timely treatment.
Very good. All right. Cool.
So hi. So the question I'm asking is essentially, which might affect most of us, macular degeneration. Once we hit greater than 50 years, that's when age-related macular degeneration starts. So the first condition is dry macular degeneration, and the late or advanced stage is wet macular degeneration. So our target is greater than 50, dry condition.
Dry macular degeneration.
Right. And
So
patients.
at the time that's first diagnosed, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
And patients, and I want to kind of see if most of us, if they are high cholesterol, are taking statin. So with statin, who are taking statin.
With statin.
With statin.
Okay.
And how likely are they to develop wet macular degeneration in 5 years time frame?
Wet macular degeneration in 5 years. All right. Very good. Andrew's got one.
The target population would be women with breast cancer on anthracyclines.
Breast cancer on
Anthracycline containing.
anthracyclines.
Anthracycline.
Okay.
And outcome is CHF diagnosis at discharge for hospital.
Okay. And what's the time window?
Anytime after initiation of treatment, maybe with a 3-month window following initiation of treatment,
So
something like that.
3 month to all time?
Yep.
Okay. You else want to volunteer one?
So I've just changed mine to one that I think is probably easier in an observational database. The quick backgrounder is the USPTF, the screening task force, recently upgraded some recommendations around low-dose lung cancer screening for smokers based on some evidence that it could be cost-effective. But we know that there's known to be drift in how that model is calibrated. So right now we allocate it based on years free from tobacco and certain amount of pack year smoking history. But that over time we're going to be definitely screening lots of people who are never going to get cancer and irradiating them and missing people who do get cancer. And so the question, the target cohort would be smokers.
Smokers?
Aged 45 or older. The outcome cohort would be lung cancer, and developed over the next 5 years. And the model stuff
5 years?
Yeah.
And so what is your T is, what's the index for T?
The index time?
So smokers, people are smokers forever. So when they started smoking or at a given visit when they are a smoker, how would you operationalize your T cohort there?
That's a good question. Clinically what would be happening is you'd have somebody coming in for a routine kind of health maintenance visit, and you would have to have at least, to be considering them for the screening, you'd be asking about their pack year smoking history, which 35 pack years I think is the...
So yep, that sounds perfect. Yep, got it. Good. All right. Melanie? Oh, hold on a second. All right.
It's not on. Oh, it is on. Okay, so mine's very simple. I was just thinking about otitis media or ear infections before the age of 18 being my target. My outcome being any type of ear tube surgery like tympanostomy or myrotomy. And I was going to say the time at risk was from first diagnosis to 5 years, but Atlas only gives you 1,095 days as a drop-down option.
You can just type into that text box.
You could just type into the
Yep.
text box. You don't have to use drop-down. Perfect. Let's go with 5 years.
All right. So children with otitis media at the first time that are diagnosed with otitis media?
Yep.
Okay, and whether or not they have an ear surgery of some sort?
Yep.
Okay, great.
And then like a rate ratio, like a Poisson or something like that.
Next. Okay, non-malignant hematology. adults with sickle beta 0 thal, which is a type of sickle
You're going to have to
cell
like
disease.
slow that down for the
Okay.
for the non-clinician.
All right, sorry.
I just heard a whole bunch of words. So
All right,
people
adults,
with cancer.
No. Adults age 18 or over
Okay.
with sickle beta 0 thal, which is a type of sickle cell disease.
Tau. Okay.
Very severe, who develop, I would like any kind of renal dysfunction, but we might have to limit it to chronic kidney disease. And I would do it over 10 years.
10 years, okay. Okay, coming back. Nicole's been patiently waiting. We'll give Nicole, and we'll come back to Christoph, and I think Sergio had one too.
Okay. So our target cohort is a patient newly admitted to a nursing home. So any first admission to a nursing home, our outcome is going to be a hip fracture in either 6 months or 1 year after.
Was that during the 6 month, or is that just 2 different time windows?
Either, yeah, 2 different time windows.
I see.
Yeah.
Got it.
And then we're going to do a model, one that does interactions, because there's going to be a lot of interactions that might impact on hip fractures, like medicines or whatever. So maybe not just the lasso, but some of the others. And then what else do we need to say? I think that's all. And what we're going to do with that is try to predict who needs to wear some sort of hip protection or look at stopping sedative medicines or something like that. So.
Very good. All right, Christoph.
So this is related to the one you were mentioning, discussions that death data is really a problem in trying to look at time to event data. So I'd propose picking a target cohort. It could be all people, but for simplicity, let's say greater than 18 years old with at least 2 bipolar diagnoses. The outcome would be death, and the time at risk would be 1 year prior to the end of observation.
I'm sorry, is that the last part?
1 year prior to the end of observation. So you're basically last day of observation and back a year, because death can only happen at that very last day or not. The time at risk is really the last day, I guess, but then you'd have the covariates from 1 year before.
So what is the index date for your T?
1 year prior to the end of observation, i.e. the last event in the table, in the tables.
Last visit.
Last of any events.
That is.
And so there's people who either died or didn't die by that last.
So is it the last visit, or is the last visit minus a year? I'm sorry, just last visit. Is that what you want to use for the baseline covariate? I'm sorry.
So I want to use covariates from the year prior to the very end of the
So you're basically saying people at their last visit, can we predict if they're dead?
Yes.
Okay. And so you were saying that the 1 year wasn't the time at risk, because that's really 0. It's the covariates is the year. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. So that's a phenotype application of prediction. Sergio.
Yeah. So my proposal is adult patients diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis being treated with a TNF-alpha inhibitor that develop a severe fungal infection within 1 year.
So the target was people with psoriatic arthritis who were on a TNF. Okay.
And the outcome would be new onset of a severe fungal infection.
Fungal infection. And the time period was?
1 year.
1 year. Okay. And specifically, you're really indexing at the time that they started their TNF. Yes. Yeah, so that's their index. Okay. All right. And last but not least, Wojciech, give us a winner.
Actually, something I posted already to the forum and no one picked it up. Like patient-triggered question, so it's kind of interesting. So you may have heard it. It's the second phase of the macular degeneration. So the population of interest is patients who have wet macular degeneration, might have symptoms in their first eye. The outcome is legally blind.
Okay.
And the time at risk is 20 years.
20 years, okay. All right. So first of all, I hope that you guys recognize the power of the fact that we have one framework for executing predictive models and look at all the diversity of types of questions that now you're all able to clearly and consistently describe. And while we haven't proven it to you yet, I can assert that this framework, this tool, will do all of this stuff so long as you actually had the data, which I think that's just pretty freaking cool by itself. So to Scott's suggestion, how about this? Everybody remembers we've got, see, I don't have any stickers here, but what I'd like to do is, so remember the FDA's question, hemophilia, so I'm just going to flip this question over. And then we've got these 5. You want to hold? All right, Wojciech's going to be a holder. Thank you. I'll need one other holder here. Well, that's a portion of your tea. That's called sampling the population right there. All right. So everybody gets a vote of a question, and then we were going to, and I want you to, as you're voting, yep. So it's a really good question, Ermil, and I was going to say this. So as you're voting, I want you to vote on what you think is a good clinical question and what you actually think is a viable clinical question. So just to inject my bias, I think like the wet MD blind question is a really good question, but I don't even know of a single data set that gives me 20 years of follow-up, right? I might be interested in that question if it was 1 year because I could probably observe that. It's just an example. So what I want you to be thinking about is, for each of these questions, is it something that's interesting, relevant, and could we have data? To the answer of what data are we going to do this on, we're going to do this across the OHDSI network. For purposes of what Jenna and I are going to do, we're going to design the study as a group, and I don't think we got any. For most of these questions, I've got no issues with actually being on camera and just doing this live on data that I have access to. So, all right. So, how many wants to? So everybody gets one vote. Can you all see? You remember the questions? All right. Hemophilia. The thing that's interesting here is when we say, why doesn't the FDA have one voice for things? They can't even vote on their own question. All right, thankfully Christian bailed you out, and this did get 3 votes. 1, 2, 3. All right. Hospitalized for the mechanical thrombosis stroke with readmission. You only get 1 vote, Azadeh. And another thing about the FDA, those setting the rules can't follow them. All right. Yes, that's right. In other news, I'm going to be fired from my employer tomorrow. Stroke question. Did I see one hand up for that? Sorry, I see. So what? Keep your hands up strong. So you're voting for your own? 3. 1, 2, 3. All right. Pneumonia had an ICU stay in 30 days. Ooh.
Wait, can I vote for? Because it's the same outcome. I just care about that outcome measure within a certain time frame. Yeah, I just want like.
Ooh, look at this. Now that's community building right there. Very well done.
I would vote for that just because it's a readmission.
Okay. So pneumonia, ICU stay. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Wow. We're going to call that factor 10. Is that all right there? Is there anybody else? Yeah.
that unfortunately in the data model right now, we don't distinguish ICU stays, we just distinguish inpatient stays. So I think the question would need to be changed for that one.
So I've done a bunch of work looking at ICU. So there are, in claims data, there are very explicit procedures that tell you someone is in the ICU. And so usually what I'm looking for is, I'm looking for an inpatient visit with a procedure with an ICU service. And that's how I've commonly looked up that. I'm not sure if other people have done it different ways, but what's that? That works? Okay. Okay.
There's a revenue code too on part of the claims where the revenue code identifies the location, like a unit location, so you get a bill for.
Got it. So if somebody in the community has claims data, that sounds like there's a few different mechanisms. If you have, for those of you who have EHR data, how is ICU captured? There's no actual observation or any sort that just says ICU? Got it. Okay. All right. Okay. So there's potentially, for some people who are not working with claims data, this might present a challenge. Okay. So, yeah.
I was originally hoping that we could do same stay, but I didn't, just looking through Atlas, I wasn't sure necessarily how we would be able to define that to capture one stay. So then thinking more about it, if someone's sick enough that they're coming back within 30 days and they're in the ICU, that might be something that makes it like meaningful as well.
So T0 is then discharge?
No. T0 is admission, but instead of, because I can't capture the discharge date, unless we have a way of doing that, I don't have a better way, because I'm still relatively new to this. I just said 30 days. Thinking that
If you can do it in a readmission, then you can do it in the same state too. What's the difference? Why would you be able to do it in a new admission and not in the one that?
Yeah, so if you're saying that we can find the discharge date, then that'd be fine.
Yeah. Why do we need discharge date? They can still be in the office.
Yeah, that's what he wants. Yeah. He wants to predict who, normally we'd like to predict who would go to the ICU once they're admitted. But what we're saying is that it's still a value to say, well, okay, somebody came in, got better enough, left, but wound up coming back in and going right to the ICU in 30 days. Probably has something to do with something around the way to present.
It's more actionable for the institution if they know it's going to be within their hospital stay right now.
Yeah, there is a start date in it. It wasn't clear if he could fully specify that now, because that's why he's.
Don't worry about what Atlas can or can't do for purposes of thinking about this.
I do not want them to go. But the other command is 30 days that, with bundled payments that,
30 days.
like if they come back,
Got it. Got it.
If it's within 30 days where they went home, I didn't go home.
Our job as a community should be to answer clinical questions that matter, not restrict ourselves to the subset of things that software may or may not do, or our preconceived notions of what software may or may not do.
ideally, from time of risk is day of admission to day of discharge.
Okay, all right. So I think Wojciech's right that if that's got 10 votes, so are we okay as a class working on that? All right, go do it. Well, neither is me coming up here and doing it for you. That's not doing it together either. So we've got how much time? We got like an hour left. All right. Yes, I might need a Diet Pepsi for this. What I'd actually, in all seriousness, what I would encourage all of you to do is play around and think through the answers to the questions on the forms. There's two pieces of this. How are we actually going to define the cohorts, and what are the answers to the questions of all the model pieces? And depending on where your area of interest is, you play in either of those spaces. I'd encourage you really, and I would recommend for this exercise, try to be doing it yourself and playing around with it. I'm going to also just do it and talk aloud as I'm trying to do this, so that if you do want to just sit back and watch, you can, but I'd encourage you to play around and think about it for yourself. There is no right answer to this, and certainly I'm pretty confident we're going to get this done here in the next hour, but it's not like we are going to be done with the world's polished solution because I don't know the clinical space well enough to get this exactly right. But I think collectively we can probably get approximately good to demonstrate what could be possible. And I don't know, maybe we take a whole other second hour to write our JAMA paper afterwards, okay? So please play along. I am going to be doing this on Atlas. We're logged in actually to our local instance at J&J just so I can test cohorts and see if we get numbers back. But just to be, so there's no like cards up my sleeve or anything. This is the exact same Atlas that you all are playing with on the OHDSI website. It's just that the OHDSI website only has simulated data to be able to test out cohorts and concept sets and that kind of thing. All right? So yeah, what question are we answering? So let's write it down. Jose, could you? So let's actually before we start actually typing the screen, let's now be a little bit more precise about this. So T. Can we try to come up with a little bit more precise definition of T? Oh, I'm sorry, Ray. I'm sorry. You were so passionate about switching your vote. I'm sorry, Ray. I'm sorry. Yes.
It's on now. All right. So I was saying all patients who are admitted to the hospital with a diagnosis of pneumonia. All adults? We can specify adults. All adults. Age.
So with a diagnosis of pneumonia. And you were saying now it's adults, yep. Which means what age?
Greater than or equal to 18.
So age.
I was going to say any pneumonia.
Okay.
You mean if they're getting the diagnosis code?
They must be coming with it.
Yeah, because if we're filtering by diagnosis code, then it would be hard to figure out when during their hospital course, unless we're able to tell is it a primary diagnosis.
I would take the hospital-acquired pneumonias out because it's its own whole issue. So if you get the real pneumonias from the outside, yeah, that's a good question.
So excluding.
So I would do admission pneumonia.
Community-acquired pneumonia. Okay. Make it clean.
No, I know that we're not supposed to be kind of thinking about the data, but usually if you're getting that temporality, does that present a problem, right? Because typically the code will be associated with a stay.
Yep.
And you don't know whether it came at admission or when it actually happened during the stay.
Yep.
There's a present on arrival indicator for the probably primary diagnosis versus secondary diagnosis, and that claim results.
So No, it's a good point. Let me just ask, because I don't know the clinical space very much. So this person, they're going to come to the hospital and they're going to have a diagnosis code, and there's some wondering about if we really have the precision in our data to tie that to the first data or not. But what about a person who had pneumonia diagnosis, let's say in the outpatient setting the week before? Would you want them in this cohort?
Yes, but then they would still be coming in with that diagnosis code.
Okay, so it is not like it's not an incident pneumonia and sort of like first occurrence of the diagnosis. It's just hospital with pneumonia.
Yeah, hospitalization of pneumonia.
Okay. Are there specific people in this population that you would legitimately want to exclude for some reason?
If you want to throw everything in the model, then I think the idea is to just keep everything in the model.
So all of these people, there's not like you want to exclude cancer people, for example, or something like that.
That might end up being a risk, not a risk, a predictor in the model. Okay. But if that is, then that's something that's worthwhile capturing.
Okay.
So I would just toss out that there is that benchmark Medicare pneumonia hospitalization, and they have like a lot of exclusions for like immune suppression, oncology drugs, all these things that would just sort of compromise your system in general. So you getting weakness for pneumonia, like being weak, frail state, getting pneumonia is very different and the trajectory is very different. You would have like heterogeneity of effects if you try to predict a model with one group versus the other. So it might make sense to homogenize just a little bit, as Patrick was saying.
So I'll just open an open question. Maybe as we're playing around, we could think about that like a question of would you want to exclude people with cancer? Yeah, so the beautiful thing here is that if you wanted to change your T, you just change your T, apply the same approach. Okay, any other thoughts about T? Oh, sorry, Matt?
So I was just calling that the measure itself, like there's a standardized measure and they put a series of exclusions on it. The rationale being that there's very different prediction, like rates of events in the different populations. So if you're trying to get at a general population estimate of readmission with pneumonia, these other guys, for example, oncology is being readmitted all the time. Maybe they're being readmitted for other reasons too.
It's solving a different problem. So if I'm a provider, I don't want to be, if I'm a provider, and those are kind of quality measures. If I'm a provider, I don't want to be evaluated, against a readmission for somebody who has, a bunch of immunosuppression, because it wouldn't, that's not a fair way of kind of counting my readmission rate for pneumonia, but it could be a very valid predictor for who might need to go for an ICU stay, right? So I actually would want to have that in the model. Immunosuppression would likely be a good covariate to have, or having a concurrent cancer might be a good covariate to have because of the fact that they are more prone to readmission.
So I would still, my take would be I would exclude at baseline, right? Or insert an interaction effect. I do think that you're going to have completely different estimates. If you want to include that, my go would say to include an interaction term for oncology or history of chemotherapy or something to that effect, because you really will have like different models or different sort of trajectories of those patients. You could do it both ways. I could argue.
You could do it both ways, and we have software that can do it both ways.
Other patients on immunosuppressive therapies, not just cancer patients, but rheumatoid arthritis and the other.
So let me suggest the following for purposes of this exercise. We're going to start with the T without that exclusion. If those are interested in adding some exclusions, take your T, change your T, run it yourself. All right? O, can we be clear about what the O was? ICU stay basically means you were in the ICU at some point during that same bit. Okay. In ICU at some point during that visit.
Do you also want to add death? Like as a, yeah.
What's that? Or death? So, or death. Is that, I want to be clear about this because this actually changes the question a lot in my mind anyway. Or death, because now I've got people with the ICU and people with death. I'm going to guess that most of those people are going to be old men with failing hearts, which is probably not what you have in mind.
Maybe you're right. You probably leave it out. Yeah. I mean, I guess the way I was initially thinking was that these are people who maybe should have gone to the ICU, but there could have very well be great reasons they didn't go to the ICU.
So would you want to say patients who are admitted who don't?
Yeah, stick with the original. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Nicole?
I think we're missing a big point here about what we're doing this for. So when we're talking about who's in, who's out, what's our outcome, what do we want to use it for? So somebody's coming in to hospital because they have pneumonia. Why do we want to predict who goes to ICU? So when we started talking about, okay, now we're going to add death, that's a whole other thing.
So what's the clinical motivation here?
So the clinical motivation is, I think, twofold. The first is identifying those who are sick enough to need closer monitoring. So part of it is not everyone goes to the ICU right away. And so to be able to identify those patients who are at higher risk, to keep a closer eye on them, or to, obviously more closely monitor and take care of them. And the second piece is the moment you walk in through the door, if you're able to, there are sometimes patients who get delays in care that kind of lead to them going to the ICU. So if you can more quickly identify those high-risk patients, you can proceed with caring for them sooner.
Does that address your concern? Okay.
Would you consider adding another outcome such as another complication of pneumonia such as sepsis, even though sepsis patients will end up in the ICU eventually?
Sorry for you walking back and forth. I feel like these are things that are probably worth exploring, kind of like the qualifications we're putting on immunosuppression and otherwise. But I think for the purposes of this, to keep it broad. And then beyond that, there's the added complication of how do you define sepsis. Right now, there's multiple codes. There's new ways of defining sepsis. Are you going with SIRS? Are you going with SOFA, Q-SOFA? How do you define it? Or is it diagnosis code?
Christian, can you moderate the discussion while I get started?
So
do you have a British keyboard, Jenna? Oh, Jesus. That's unfortunate.
All right. So just to go back to the motivation for 1 second, I think this is a fine question to answer, and we can build the model for it. But and we're not trying to be super impactful and have a JAMA paper right now in reality. But there are lots of a patient can walk in and you can look at them and you'd be like, they have condition X. I know that they're really in trouble right now because they have pneumonia. So I think the impactful question is can I predict people better than a doctor or something, or even remotely close to the way a doctor could predict them, because they're already seeing this patient, right? So I think that that's kind of the general rationale for me of trying to exclude somebody with cancer or exclude somebody with immunosuppressants, is trying to do this for people that you really would shrug your shoulders at when they come in, but maybe there's some added information that a model could synthesize.
Within the same index visit, so index visit for pneumonia, index visit ICU, is that what we're currently set up to do? Yeah. So my question is now, because I thought we were doing readmission, but it shifted, which is fine. The question is, do we have enough resolution in the OHDSI data to detect? Because most of these physiological deterioration models that are predicting this have time scale of hours of data and data points and vital multivariate time series feeds in order to predict something meaningful. So if we're within ED presentation to then ICU 6 hours later, is that level or that gradation of time slips in OHDSI? I don't know. So that's
So I guess I'll answer that question in two ways. So we have a data model that could support as much fidelity as a source has. We have sources who don't have much fidelity. The hypothesis that you're posing is without the fidelity, you hypothesize we might not get a good model. That's a completely testable empirical question. And right now, what we're going to do this on, I don't have very high fidelity data. So if your hypothesis is right, our prior going into this is that we might get a low AUC. And then our conclusion could be either I don't have the right data or sufficient data for the question. But if I had a data set with that fidelity, what we're walking through right now would take advantage of that information and make use of it.
I can try to build this on the Stride. They have at least, I don't know exactly how good the data is, but I'm going to see what you do and then try to build the same thing. At least there's some EMR timelines that are in it, so might be able to pull some stuff out.
And I'm not sure how much necessarily timing matters, as long as you're in the ICU at some point. I don't think we necessarily need to measure the way you're crashing or you're progressing.
The ICU is the outcome, and the ICU is the outcome, and then you have to do that time zero. So you want a set of features before the time zero in order to predict forward. And I mean, just in my head, it's really the flow sheet data and the EHR that will be predictive here. So if there's a timeline or something like that to your time zero, and you have some downward slope and things that are important, or organ failure development, then I think you have a good chance of predicting. But lacking that, I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, we'll find out, right? We'll find out. We'll find out.
When you step in the door, can you tell me who's high risk?
Correct.
At most, getting a glance at your vitals, but even without vitals, when you walk in, based on your history, can I tell you who's high risk? Okay. I think that's covariates preceding.
Wait a second.
This thinking aloud concept was very interesting, and you are doing a lot of interesting expert-driven things, which I would like to hear
Yep.
your thinking aloud.
I'm happy to talk aloud. I just didn't want to interrupt.
So microphone goes off. Patrick, tell us. Show us the magic.
So I'm starting here by defining our target cohort, people admitted to the hospital with diagnosis of pneumonia. I've done that by defining an initial event. The index event is people with a visit occurrence, and that visit occurrence is an inpatient visit, which is a standard concept. We said that they have to be age greater than or equal to 18 at that point in time. I, just as a placeholder, put in here, it was an open question we need to consider, how much prior time before the hospitalization do we want? I've put 365 days, but it's actually a community discussion. The importance for prediction problems is the more you require, the more data you're going to have about the medical history in order to try to predict the outcome. So in this space, is it really important that we have a long history about a person, or is it more like a cute short-term thing that we would care about?
How do you, let's say pneumonia, how do I know which concepts are in your pneumonia?
Let's answer the first question first, and I promise I haven't gotten to that one yet. So Ray, how much time do we need?
Yeah, I would say 1 year is reasonable.
Okay.
I think that's reasonable enough for you to be able to capture the conditions for which someone is seeing a doctor on a regular basis, so their chronic conditions, in addition to any recent hospitalizations, procedures, or anything else that might put them at risk.
Okay.
Patrick, why would we care? Wouldn't the method kick out those guys who have nothing, no features to predict anything?
So this is actually restricting the population. So you might say, amongst people who I have 3 years of prior history, and that because I'm going to then make use of 3 years of prior history of data. If I do this, which I think this is a reasonable decision to use, but if I only require 1 year, then that means there will be some people who only have 1 year. Let's imagine that the strong predictor for this was cancer 5 years ago. Then if you only require 1 year, a lot of people wouldn't have that observation just because you didn't require it.
But I think the question is not whether we make it longer, the question is whether we make it shorter. So if there are people in it who just are healthy and then some bad things happen and they get to the hospital, there is no prior information in there. Do we care?
So you can run this as long or as short as you want. It's just that by requiring a period of time, you're requiring that people have medical history. And so as opposed to the assumption that because it's not there, it didn't happen in their history, which, the absence of evidence, evidence of absence challenge. Okay? So No, we are defining our T right now. We are not on our model. We are just defining a T, and we're saying which people do we want. So we want people who have a hospitalization and have a year of time in the past. That's going to guarantee that our T is going to have at least 1 year of data to try to use to predict in the future. Okay? That means we're going to drop people if they entered into the insurance claim and then immediately went to the hospital. We're not going to use them for this prediction purpose.
Most appropriate to model the real physician scenario. Because how likely that an inpatient doctor has their full medical history to consider in their thing. So the model should be about the same knowledgeable as the physician.
But a doctor doesn't know nothing. A doctor sees that person admitted. So I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, Ray or Evan, but you see a patient admitted, you can pretty much scope up what's going on with that person at that time, and you have some approximate medical history for some approximate
And I think
time.
that's the purpose of having an EHR.
Yeah.
And ideally in a non-broken system, you would have a good medical history. Of course, with a fragmented system, sometimes you don't.
So for this inpatient visit, they have to be at least 18 years old. We will just require a year for this purposes, but we also want that person to have a diagnosis of pneumonia. So I've said at least 1 occurrences of a condition occurrence record of pneumonia, and I've restricted it to the same visit occurrence, meaning that diagnosis code has to happen in the index visit that we defined. Okay?
What about the condition type at first position or some sort of?
If we wanted to require that it was like a primary diagnosis or something like that, then you could also just go right here and say we could require the condition type, and we could say, maybe we're saying primary. If you wanted to have an inpatient detail, does the pneumonia need to be the primary diagnosis?
Why? Why would it be the primary?
Doesn't need to be, but I think if you want to make it cleaner, ideally that would be the reason that they're there. So yeah, primary is.
Okay. So we'll just now. I will be clear that we are talking an awful lot here about things that are very claims motivated, right? So I'm happy to add this kind of thing that I'm now saying you had a hospitalization and you have to those things, but now I'm saying and you have to have a type field from an inpatient detail claim that said primary. And
I wouldn't.
And so the main point I want to make is we can use this tool to orient ourselves into a solution, but now by making that choice, we've made a solution that basically only really applies to a claims universe. If you've got an electronic health record data, you'll still have hospitalizations, you'll still have pneumonias, but you wouldn't have a type field of inpatient detail record. So it's just a matter of how you generalize your question. Don't do that? Okay. Urmila has the mic.
Okay, so you are using all events per person, so it's going to count each time they came to the hospital for inpatient for pneumonia. So it's going to count multiple visits per person?
It's a good question. We have an open choice here. So what I've done here is I've said, let's find all hospitalizations that you're over 18 and have 365 days. But then for each of those, we're checking to see if they have pneumonia. And then in this particular case, just as default, I'm saying let's pick the first of those. So we had to check all the hospitalizations, filter down to the one that we wanted, and then use that. But that's also a choice we get to make, is are we trying to predict, one or many? Okay?
So if you didn't limit to earliest event, you could have a person appearing multiple times in the data, and we could be looking at, hey, 4 months ago they had pneumonia, 3 months.
Correct. So based on our definition of cohorts, a cohort is a person who satisfies criteria for a duration of time. In this case, a person could come and go because they would have a hospitalization, leave the hospital, have a hospitalization, leave the hospital, in which case each one of those cohort entries could be used. So I would recommend, in general, I would recommend trying to think about it as one event per person, simply because you do have some statistical concerns that are represented in that you now have what look like independent observations, but in fact it's the same person and there's correlation structure of that person. So just for a cleaner thing, I don't see any reason why you'd want to have those extra visits. But that's my choice versus your choice. You could do it the other way around. Okay?
Yeah, I guess we're now excluding people who have any prior pneumonias, really. So
No. We're not.
If we're doing the earliest
every person who has at least one hospital with pneumonia will be in there. They'll just be in the data set once instead of being in the data set multiple times.
The event we're looking at would be the earliest inpatient visit of pneumonia, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Therefore,
so that none of them will have a prior hospitalization for pneumonia.
For pneumonia, that's
yes.
my,
Yeah.
And that's what I have a
Got
problem
it.
with. Yeah.
You think that that's a good predictor? Okay. All right. Go ahead and make your own T. Very good. All right. We're okay with that as our T? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and let's see. Do you mind if I run this at IMS? Run it at IMS. All right. We'll run it in Truven. And do we have any Optum folks in the room? No. No, I asked.
Can't refuse then.
No, I'd like for them to. Let's see. Germany. We're running in Japan. Let's see what happens in France and Australia. Yeah. I have not submitted an ISAC protocol to the UK, so I cannot run it in CPRD. All right. I've got a hospital database. Maybe we could see what goes on there. All right. We'll run it in Medicare. We'll run it in Medicaid. Okay. All right. While those are running, and some of them are already finished, let's go ahead and create our O. I'm going to be lazy here and say our O is, what was our O again? I'm sorry. Okay. ICU stay. All right. So people with ICU All right, so you guys have had a lot of time working on this on your own. Did you guys find ICU? What's that? You failed? Okay.
So there are some useful concept sets on the J&J servers, so we may not have good luck. I mean, not thinking in the raw vocabulary, but I think you found the inpatient visit in your prior concept sets. The same for pneumonia.
Yeah. Actually, that's a very good point, Wojciech. Let me actually talk about what I did there. So, because I did skip over that. So when I'm on here, I am able to import whatever concept sets have already been put into the tool. And so I took for granted real quickly that I typed in pneumonia, and there was one, because somebody in my community has already previously done a study of pneumonia, and I didn't actually even bother to look at it because I trust the folks that are working in my community that that's probably a good starting point anyway. So I clicked on that thing, but for those who are not familiar with how the vocabulary works, that's not just a word, that's a concept set, which I've now entered in twice into my tool. But specifically in the SNOMED vocabulary, there is one concept called pneumonia, and we're using pneumonia and any of its descendants. That actually represents 222 different medical entities. So that one idea, pneumonia, is in fact an awful lot of stuff. But if I sort on using the Achilles counts, I can actually sort to see of all the different flavors of pneumonia, which ones actually show up in a particular database. And so I can see the actual code, just pneumonia by itself, is the most common code that's used. And actually I'll sort on record count here. But then we've got bacterial pneumonia, pneumococcal pneumonia, idiopathic pneumonia, bronchopneumonia, etc. So Ray, Evan, the clinical experts, are there any that is the top of this list that look like things you wouldn't want in your definition of pneumonia?
You would take the fibrosis off?
You don't like that one? No. Okay. So if we saw something in the list we didn't want, you just go ahead and click that, and then you would just say, okay, we don't want that, so let's just exclude that. Okay. So now it's every pneumonia minus the whatever that is, that thing that you just did.
Assuming that you had like 1,000 real pneumonias that you know that you care about, are there ways to generate like validity scores or something? This concept, current iteration, and truth?
So what you're really getting at is basically the more broader notion is phenotyping in general. So like right now I'm basically looking for effectively a code in a diagnosis thing. This is not a broad scale phenotype. There is a lot of community effort and excitement around creating phenotypes so that maybe there's actually a more precise way to find pneumonia. But what I heard from the discussions, we're just looking for someone with a diagnosis code of pneumonia. So if that exists, we have our community library to be available, and there's a work group that's focused on that. But here I don't know whether those codes are good or bad, and frankly, I've never actually done any study on pneumonia, so I have no idea whether this is legit or not. Okay, so we've got, okay. So perfect. Yay, community involvement. So let me drop this. You got a CPT code. So that's a procedure. All right. So what we want to do is we're going to want to create a new concept set for ICU. Your keyboard, Brits. All right, CPT code. Yeah, let me have it.
4169F and 4168F.
All right, there's a lot of things with CPT4. There are 4169F. Okay.
It says patient either not receiving care.
It's patient either not receiving care in the ICU or not. So that's a not, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I thought it was a not of the other one. So the 416F is patient receiving care in the ICU and receiving mechanical ventilation.
Which one's that? Let's say read the number again.
4168F.
8F. Okay, so I'm going to click on this, and that's the one that, so we would agree that that one, patient receiving care in ICU, that's good. But Joel's already looked to see in the vocabulary, we can actually see whether or not we can explore the relationships that Christian has so graciously built us to march our way up, and we can actually see that there is a broader concept for intensive care monitoring. So if we select intensive care monitoring, it might be worthwhile checking to see if that's all ICU or if there's some other kind of intensive care. So let's see what we got here. So the numbers are small. So, but these things look kind of good to me. They're kind of good to you guys?
Yep, they do.
Okay, so let's take that. But yeah, those numbers still seem suspiciously small.
So what about the ventilation, actually, or intubation?
Yeah. So what's the revenue code?
ICU 200 to 209. These are critical care room and board charges.
The number is just 200?
200, 201, 202, all the way to 209.
Okay. Can you, so maybe, I don't know, people with laptops could search the vocabulary and let's try to find things. What's that? You have record counts on you have records on SynPuff. All right, 200 was we were looking for, what was it? It was a revenue code, you said?
So generally, the procedures we'd see in an inpatient setting would be, in the U.S., would be ICD-9 PCS, right? And CPT-4 would tend to be outpatient. And so the ICD-9 PCS, which is like, that's our destination vocabulary, correct? So non-operative intubation irrigation, 96.
What's the number?
Well, 96 and descendants, although some of the descendants are, you may want to exclude.
PCS. No, PCS for the 10 and PROC for the 9. Yeah.
It would be very helpful to give me 1 second to just click on the, I'm still finishing Jose's list here. So we got all the 200s. That was what yours? Yep. Okay, now Melanie, what?
So the ID is 362-06767.
Okay. No, I'm sorry, I fat fingered that. 0?
No, 36206767.
So I search space ICU space and clicked revenue code, and there are 3 revenue codes: incremental nursing charge rate ICU, intensive care post ICU.
Hold on a second, Wojciech. I want to find Melody's and then I want to do yours, but I'm not finding it. What's the name of it? I think I'm just doing something dense.
Admission evaluation note.
Mission evaluation note.
Likely limited by intensive care units.
Okay, LOINC. So what did I? LOINC hierarchy. Okay. Admission, perfect. Okay. Now Wojciech.
So search. I have descendant record count is zeros, but if you search for 0233 or 0206, 0233, it should be, there should be a revenue code called incremental nursing charge rate -ICU.
I'm sorry. It's a revenue code. Okay. Okay.
And restrict to revenue codes.
All right, so that's 0. Okay. Any others? You had said something, Christian, mechanical ventilation?
For intubation. Just for the, as a...
Okay, so there's a ICD-9. Was this actually what you were talking about, Christoph? 9.6? All right. Okay. Is that, Ray, are those things that...
So, yep.
Okay.
So...
Okay. Not that one. Okay.
Patrick?
Yeah. Andrew?
There's a place of service code, an OMOP-generated place of service code for intensive inpatient care facility.
The care site knows it's an ICU.
Yeah, but the data doesn't have that. It's not from claims. Yeah, not from claims.
Maybe that's an EHR specific thing. I don't know.
So it's a good point, Andrew, that yes, there's lots of different places we can look for it. So if your data had care sites that actually then designated the ICU, you could do that. Our claims data wouldn't have that specification.
Because they don't give you the provider information, that's why. Because it's all in there.
So for, yep, go ahead. Sorry, yep. One more, Ray.
Look for concept ID 4148981.
All right, intensive care unit. Very good. All right, for purposes of this exercise, I want to be 100% clear. This is not the way that you would create a concept set for doing a fully validated study, is just shout out random numbers and click buttons. But the point is that the tool will allow you to navigate and explore and find the right things that you actually want to do responsibly. Let's just assume for a second that that would be our definition. Okay, and I will see whether or not. So now, I'm sorry. So now I've got, I'm going to take all visits, and I have to select ICU. I'm sorry? Good point. So in the concept set, some of those things were, it's a very good point. Let's point this out. Of all of those various codes that you guys randomly threw out there, some of them are procedures, some of them are observations, some of them are even measurements. And so that means we actually need to look across multiple domains in the common data model to actually look for those things. So we looked for a procedure occurrence of an ICU. We need to look for a measurement of an ICU. I don't know how that would have happened, but that is what our vocabulary tells us. And an observation. So did I get them all? Those were the ones? Okay.
You should have a button anywhere.
What's that?
Should have a button anywhere.
What do you mean anywhere?
So you don't have to select the domains.
Got it. We welcome community contributions to any software application, Christian.
I said it very quietly.
We should also have a vocabulary that doesn't put ICUs in measurements.
Well, we don't know what that actually is. That's loink. It's a loink answer.
All right, so let's just send that to the US.
We're gonna,
and we'll send that
send
that over to Optum. And we'll send that over to
doesn't matter because it's when he
France
searches
and
for it,
Germany.
he's only going to find standard codes anyway. So.
And we'll send that to Australia. We'll send this to. All right. All right. Okay. So we've got a T. We've got an O. Let's just go back to our prior T to see how we're doing. Tutorial T. Okay, let's see. Do we have any people with a hospitalization with pneumonia? Yeah, we've got some in Japan. We got some in Optum. We've got some in Premier. We've got some in all of our U.S. data. Okay, so I've got cohorts for us to do this. Jenna's going to walk you through the next part of it. Before I do that, I've just done this at J&J, but you all are part of the network, and we want to do this study together. So I'm just going to actually take this cohort definition, and if I had the right window, maybe this window, I'm going to go ahead and just openly share my cohort definition with all of you. So now you guys can do everything I'm doing. Close. Create a new cohort. We're going to call that PLP tutorial T group study on pneumonia. All right. And we're going to give you all right. All right. I just gave you guys the study. You go ahead and do it yourself. That's out on odyssey.org. You can go ahead and play, or those of you who are talking about whether you want restrictions or stuff, go ahead and make a copy of that. Contribute, pull it down to your own site, run it, do whatever you want. Okay? So I will put the O out there too. I'm nothing if not accommodating. All right. Although I'm less accommodating on this British keyboard, though, I'm going to say.
So if you import cohort, will it import the concept set into the global concept set?
Not as they're part of the cohort, so they're not separate. They're not broken out as separate concept sets. They're just inside of that cohort.
There is correctly a global concept set and an inside cohort.
Every cohort has its own concept sets. And so when we pull one in, all we're doing is we're grabbing it from the external repository and put it inside of the cohort. But those things could be different things. They're not linked up in any way. Tutorial O.
Because of the licensing of the vocabulary. Because of the licensing of the vocabulary, it might not allow you to completely take all the terms, all the dependent concepts.
Well, it's going to go in there. It's not going to find anything.
Hey, there's 477 people in the T group.
Yay! There we go. Look at that.
I'm pretty sure because I searched.
All right.
I see
You guys
all
have
those
your
codes.
T.
I
You
searched
guys
them.
have your
Zero
O.
counts.
I'm going to close this. PLP tutorial. Pneumonia with ICU. So, all right, so I'm gonna start this for Jenna here. I'm just gonna get the PLP tutorial T. I'm gonna get the POP tutorial O. Okay. Ray, what kind of model did you want to run?
The recommendation was to try lasso first on all of them.
Yep, we'll try lasso. Okay. So we want to do inside of the visit, right? In an ideal world. So actually, here's an interesting case where I forgot about that when we did this. So actually, I need to revise our definition of O for just a second, because I need my O's to actually be O's with pneumonia and the ICU in order to be there. So let's just go ahead and make that change. Sorry, Jenna, for delaying the fun.
It doesn't do the intersection itself? Patrick, it does do the intersection itself, doesn't it?
But we would have to define a time period, so it would at least it would be possible for someone to have a different visit. You wanted it specifically inside the same exact visit.
Yeah.
So. I'm eating all of the time that Jenna actually needs to actually execute this because this is a big cohort, so sorry for that, Jenna. This is kind of like our typical project together. I take all of the time and all of the glory, and then we do make you do all of the work, so it works out nicely.
Well, the 0O cohort will help us with the speed thing.
That's true.
Oh, Jenna.
Okay. With that, and this being any. All right, so there's my revised O. Okay. I know, but then I was talking aloud and not paying attention. I deleted the pneumonia on there. While that's going to be sitting there, let's come over here and let's just pick the one that we had for purposes of getting going, because it'll be fine. Oops. O. All right. And we picked a lasso. In this particular case, since it's going to be the same visit, it actually won't matter, but I'm going to say it's 30 days, but since it's linked together, it's not going to actually be immaterial. It's going to be immaterial. People without time at risk should be removed. We don't need to worry about that. Should only the first exposure per subject be included? In this case, we already have the first hospitalization, so that's going to be fine. Include patients with outcomes who are not observed the whole time at risk. In this case, we're okay because we don't actually require them to be there for the time window. It's just your overlapping visit. Should we sample a cohort? Jenna says, absolutely yes. We are going to sample to make this computationally feasible. Are you okay with 10,000 people? We're going to have no O's? Okay, we're going to have no O's, so we'll see how that goes. We're going to remove patients who have observed the outcome prior to cohort entry. So that actually is possible. What about a person who had a hospitalization with pneumonia prior, with ICU prior? Would you want them to be kicked out? Okay. How many days look back from cohort for the outcome? Oh, that's sorry. Said no, and I clicked yes, obviously. We're going to do a test trading split. We're going to do it on time or person, Jenna? Person? Okay. And then what covariates should we use? What did you learn today? What covariate should we use? All. Oh, in terms of extracting the data. Okay. So we would recommend, if you had more than 15 minutes to execute this, that you select all, but we're just going to pick a couple windows there just for the fun of it. Okay? Yep, I did conditions and drugs in a year, if that's okay. All right. Key here is that I'm going to hit save. I've now done the easy work of designing a full-fledged prediction study, and I have written my protocol, which states exactly what I'm doing, what options I've specified, what covariates I have selected, and you've got all your code sets to define everything that you want to do. The handoff now would be that Jenna could actually take this R-coded step through the steps to actually execute this. And Joel, what is the counts on our persons? Can you just look, since you're on EPI, JJ, pick one of the databases that just has a reasonable sample there.
What was the cohort number?
4935, 4936.
Oh, you're on. I don't need the microphone for you.
So this is the T. What size do you want?
I did not. I'm happy to do so. Or
More than the ICU, more than the initial one, more than the T.
Well, the original O were just different things. So that makes sense.
In fact, that would be almost a better step to run on your server, just to click Heracles on the O cohort.
And if we were teaching a course on cohort characterization, we would do that.
No, I mean, if we are worried about zero, we could find out faster.
On the Heracles? Actually, I don't even know what you're referring to.
This explore. Once I am cohort, I'm exploring the ICUO.
Yeah.
Click either explore or kick off this report. But I don't know what happens. I should see the persons, right? How many people are in such a cohort?
Well, but when you click on that, that's kicking off a complete cohort characterization. So that's a timely activity. It's not just a count. The count comes from just the generate tab of how many people are in the cohort.
Oh, actually, we've got.
So that's how I found 359.
All right, so we had 10,000 people in the T. We had 400 outcomes. And we've now predicted the model, and we can predict it with an AUC of 0.88.
Wow.
JAMA, here we come. There you go, Ray. Ray with a lead author paper.
Okay, so this is things that were more common in the people who had the outcome. And were actually included into the model.
Actually, let's take a second to look at them. So what was that top dot up there? So having acute respiratory failure on or in the prior 365 days, what you can observe on this graph is that over 80% of the people who did get the ICU had that diagnosis code, whereas approximately 20% didn't. So on a univariate basis, you would say that there was a relationship between acute respiratory failure and whether or not you went on to go to the ICU. That doesn't sound like you have to have an MD to say, yeah, that sounds like that might be possible.
But that could have been diagnosed at the time of admission.
That could also be on that same exact visit. That could be the diagnosis at that time.
That would be. Wouldn't you have diagnosed?
No, you can have a respiratory failure, and then you get a pneumonia on top of it, and then you're in a bad shape. So this makes 100% sense.
So the second one that you're highlighting there, Jenna, is sepsis. So sepsis, 16, let's say we said that, about 40% of the people who ultimately are in the ICU during that visit have sepsis, whereas 16% who don't have the ICU had sepsis. Does that make any sense? Yeah? Okay. Disturbance of consciousness. So now we're at something that 28% of the people with the ICU get disturbance of consciousness, 5% without ICU get disturbance of consciousness.
Does that mean we made them unconscious, or that they were already unconscious?
No, it's not causal. It's just a correlation. Not causal. And that's it.
Okay, so actually, so I've been giving Jenna a hard time because I think that this graph is one of the most profound things we can do, but it's so easy to overinterpret. So I want to just be very clear and reinforce what we actually are looking at here. This is the univariate statistic of just the prevalence of the covariate in those with the outcome and those without the outcome. This does not tell you what is a risk factor, because that is a forbidden word, as you learned today. Nor does this say that because that's up there that should definitely be in the model or definitely not. It is simply saying on a univariate basis, here's a variable that is different. If there was no difference between those with and without the outcome, you'd be right on the 45-degree line. In this particular thing that Jenna's showing, though, we're coloring those that the model happened to choose versus those that the model happened not to choose. So the blue ones are what the model, oh, you just turned it off.
We could get it off as well then.
So the blue ones are the ones that the model happened to choose, and the red ones are the ones the model happened not to choose. You should never overinterpret that and say, therefore, that thing is not related to the outcome, because as you learned from Peter, there's lots of different models that could all achieve good performance. So you don't want to overinterpret that. But I think that this is actually a pretty powerful tool to at least get you an understanding of what's going on in your population. So let's look at our rock and rock curve.
Can I ask a question? This part you probably would reflect. It might change how we frame this problem, but the things that you're describing here are exactly the things that said this person's going to the ICU.
Yep.
I think what we're actually looking for is at that time of admission and looking backwards, right? Because once we start to code respiratory failure, all these other things, like it's clear the person's going to ICU. I mean, that's it's a consequence of them going to the ICU in some ways. But maybe it's, is the problem that we're actually looking to solve, up to time, that index of admission and that kind of emergency room assessment.
Yeah, so potentially you're interested in a covariate that isn't inclusive of that day 0 when they entered the hospital, because a bunch of that stuff got recorded on that date. You might have wanted to, for example, have your covariates be the day before you showed up to the hospital. What do we do? So in this case, we are using whatever data is basically front-loaded on that admission. And so that, of course, in the artifacts of administrative billing claims, you could get a whole bunch of stuff front-loaded on that visit claim that would actually that would maybe, this is still valid for what the data is saying, but it might not be clinically what you were kind of hoping to tease out. So in which case, you just change your covariates, change the time window on your covariates.
I was gonna, same vein of just thinking, is that there's time contamination going on here, because these systems get logged in from the EHR once a day, more or less. They don't have the gradation of a couple hours an order is placed, and that goes on logged in. If they were admitted to the ICU the same day, all the procedure stamps or all these code stamps would co-occur. So ICU could happen in the morning, then all these health conditions or health issues could have been coded that same day afterwards. So the within same visit, I'm not so sure you have temporality separation.
But just to reinforce, that's a limitation of the data, not the data model or the tools of the practice. But as you see something like that, you want to be careful, have we actually solved the right question, or has our data potentially misled us? That's a hell of a rock curve. Are we calibrated? Pretty decently calibrated. There's a small subset of people who have a really high risk.
Not good for demographics.
Demographics, so let's see, what do we see? So it looks like women kind of have this kind of slightly increasing risk, men have it a little bit. It's kind of cool.
Now my favorite. Nothing. Nothing, Jenna.
Yeah, this is odd.
My favorite.
Who wrote this software anyway?
My favorite graph isn't there.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you've got a very, so the people who actually do go really have a much higher predicted probability, and the people who don't go to the ICU have a very low predicted probability. Here's all of the settings that actually were just executed. So you've got a full archive of everything that you did.
So, by the way, the one that we shouldn't overinterpret with the dots, is there a list for that too?
Yeah, one of the data tables is the covariate summary. Yep.
Okay. And it also says whether it's in or out, and what the beta is?
Yep.
Okay.
And the thing you do not want to do is sort that table by beta coefficient and say, this
These
thing with the
are
big
the-
beta coefficient is a risk factor.
So that was actually my question. So even if you are not supposed to do it, so in this box, in the plot, in the characterization, can I get from, let's say I have it in the R memory, I want to list all of them, all the blue dots. Just let's say I don't want to hover over every single one of them. I just want a list of them. That would be where, and are you saying I maybe should not be looking at the betas, but I want to look at the list of them?
So if we believed that this was a right model, we now want to package up and communicate the models. You absolutely do want to say, these are the variables that went into the model. And so one of the outputs is actually the covariate summary, which tells you what variables went into the model and what the beta coefficient is.
But we are not displaying it in the Shiny app, right?
That's the output CSV files, the ones that Jenna was going through. So in
Can
the
you open
output
the
folder,
file?
there's just a
Open the
big
file.
old table of that.
So then we.
This one, I guess.
Must be the last one.
There you go.
Well, it doesn't. You have to resolve that.
What? No, it's the next column over.
But I'll filter on the included yes, no. Like where
Yeah, the beta is one of those columns.
No, you don't know what these things are, so you have to resolve it. But
It is resolved, the column next to it. It's just that it's not expanded because you're in Excel.
Oh.
So we do not have time to run it. Well, you have as much time as you want. You should be running models. You guys, since it took us an hour to write a JAMA paper, and there's 50 of you, then I expect that tomorrow we should have 1,000 papers written. That seems reasonable.
we should look at the JAMA.
This will make Mark Suchard so happy.